Judge Marcus Wilson woke up at 5:30 a.m., just like he did every morning. The early autumn sun hadn't risen yet, and his bedroom was still dark. He reached over to turn off his alarm before it could wake his wife, Patricia. After 23 years of marriage, they had their morning routine down to a science. Marcus slipped out of bed and headed to the bathroom. As he brushed his teeth, he looked at himself in the mirror. At 52, his short-cropped hair showed more gray than black now, especially around the temples. The small wrinkles around his eyes had deepened over his 20 years on the bench. Being one of only 3 black judges in the county courthouse wasn't easy, but he carried that responsibility with pride. After a quick shower, he dressed carefully in his favorite charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and the blue tie Patricia had given him for his last birthday. Judges didn't wear robes to and from work, and Marcus always made sure he looked professional. "Big case today?" Patricia asked, appearing in the doorway in her bathrobe, coffee mug in hand. "Several," Marcus replied, adjusting his tie. "The Johnson hearing, and that drug possession case with Officer Daniels testifying." Patricia frowned slightly. "Daniels? Isn't he the one who's had those complaints filed against him?" Marcus nodded. 4 excessive force complaints in the last 2 years. None stuck. He didn't need to say more. They both knew what that often meant. After a quick breakfast of toast and coffee, Marcus kissed Patricia goodbye and headed out to his car. The drive to the Oakland County Courthouse took 20 minutes. He used this time to mentally prepare for the day ahead, listening to classical music on the radio. At the courthouse, Marcus entered through the judge's private entrance, nodding to the security guard. "Morning, Judge Wilson," the guard said with a smile. In his chambers, Marcus's clerk, Tanya, was already waiting with a stack of files. "Morning, Your Honor. I've organized today's cases. The Johnson hearing is at 9:30, and Officer Daniels is scheduled to testify in the Barnes case at 11 o'clock. "Thank you, Tanya," Marcus said, taking the files. "Any messages?" "The district attorney called. Said he wants to discuss the Hernandez plea deal before court starts." Marcus checked his watch. He had 30 minutes before he needed to be in his courtroom. "Tell them I can give him 10 minutes now." While waiting for the DA, Marcus reviewed Officer Scott Daniels' testimony from previous cases. The pattern was clear. Daniels was technically competent, but often bordered on disrespectful in court. He had a habit of talking over attorneys and making snide comments when challenged. The DA arrived, and after a brief discussion about the Hernandez case, Marcus changed into his judicial robe. As he did so, he thought about his father, who had worked as a janitor in this very courthouse. "One day, son," his father had told him, "you'll wear the robe and make sure everyone gets fair treatment." That promise had guided Marcus through law school, his time as a public defender, and now his career as a judge. At precisely 9:30, Marcus entered his courtroom. The bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Wilson." Marcus took his seat at the bench, glancing around the crowded courtroom. In the back row, he noticed Officer Scott Daniels in uniform talking to another officer. Daniels didn't stop talking when the court was called to order, which was unusual. Most officers showed proper respect. Little did Marcus know that this ordinary morning would soon turn into one of the most challenging days of his career. The morning session of court proceeded smoothly. Judge Wilson handled the Johnson hearing with his usual efficiency and fairness, granting a motion to suppress evidence that had been improperly obtained. By the time the court took its brief recess at 10:45, Marcus was feeling good about the day. Outside in the courthouse hallway, Officer Scott Daniels leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. At 38, Daniels had been with the Oakland Police Department for 15 years. He stood 6'2" with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl that intimidated most people he encountered. His close-cropped blonde hair and intense blue eyes completed the image of authority he worked hard to maintain. "Can't believe I have to waste my morning in Wilson's courtroom," Daniels muttered to his partner, Officer Mike Reynolds. "Guy doesn't know the first thing about police work." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, Scott. Judge Wilson is actually pretty fair. Remember when he ruled in our favor on that search warrant case last month?" Daniels snorted. "Broken clock is right twice a day. You know how he got that judgeship, right?" He lowered his voice, but not enough. "Affirmative action all the way. My uncle was on the selection committee. Said there was pressure from above to diversify the bench." Reynolds glanced around nervously. You shouldn't say stuff like that, especially here. But Daniels wasn't finished. These guys get handed positions they haven't earned. Then they want to tell us how to do our jobs. I've been on the streets 15 years. What does Wilson know about what it's like out there? What Daniels didn't notice was Tanya, Judge Wilson's clerk, standing just a few feet away, clearly within earshot. Her face remained neutral, but her hand tightened around the files she was carrying. She turned and walked quickly back toward the judge's chambers. Judge Wilson, Tanya said after knocking and entering his office, I think you should know what I just heard in the hallway. Marcus listened carefully as Tanya repeated Daniel's comments. His expression didn't change, but inside he felt a familiar disappointment. After more than 20 years in the legal system, these attitudes still existed, even if they were less common now. Thank you for telling me, Tanya, Marcus said when she finished. Please don't mention this to anyone else. When court resumed at 11 o'clock, the Barnes drug possession case was called. The defendant, a young man caught with cocaine during a traffic stop, sat beside his public defender. The prosecutor called Officer Daniels as his first witness. Daniels strode to the witness stand with confidence, almost swagger. He placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath without making eye contact with Judge Wilson. Officer Daniels, the prosecutor began, please tell the court about the events of June 15th when you pulled over the defendant's vehicle. Daniels leaned forward. I observed the defendant's car swerving between lanes on Martin Luther King Boulevard at approximately 11:30 p.m. I activated my lights and initiated a traffic stop. As Daniels continued his testimony, his tone became increasingly casual, as if he were telling a story at a bar rather than providing evidence in court. He referred to the defendant as this guy instead of the defendant, and spoke with a dismissive tone. When the prosecutor finished his questions, Judge Wilson looked at the defense attorney. Your witness, counselor. The public defender, a young woman named Sarah Chen, approached the stand. Officer Daniels, you stated that my client was swerving between lanes. Was there any other indication that he might be intoxicated? Before Daniels could answer, Judge Wilson noticed something. Officer Daniels, please remove the gum from your mouth while testifying in my courtroom. A flash of annoyance crossed Daniels' face. Instead of apologizing, he looked directly at Judge Wilson for the first time and smirked slightly. He took the gum from his mouth with exaggerated slowness and wrapped it in a tissue. The tension in the courtroom suddenly became palpable. Everyone could sense that something was about to happen. The public defender, Sarah Chen, continued her cross-examination after the gum incident. Officer Daniels, could you please explain why you searched my client's vehicle? The report indicates the breathalyzer test was negative. Daniels shifted in his seat. I smelled marijuana. That gave me probable cause. Did you find any marijuana in the vehicle? Chen asked. No, but I found the cocaine under the driver's seat. Daniels replied with a smirk. Which is why we're all here today. Chen looked at her notes. According to the dashcam footage timestamp, you searched the vehicle before administering the breathalyzer test. Is that correct? Daniels frowned. That's not how I remember it. Let's review the footage then, Chen suggested. Your Honor, may we play Exhibit C? Judge Wilson nodded. Proceed. The courtroom watched as the video clearly showed Daniels searching the car before conducting any sobriety tests. When the video ended, Chen turned back to the officer. Officer Daniels, does that refresh your memory? Daniels' face reddened. The video doesn't show everything. I had reasonable suspicion based on his behavior. What specific behavior? Chen pressed. He was nervous. Wouldn't make eye contact. Classic signs of someone hiding something, Daniels said, his voice growing louder. Judge Wilson leaned forward. Officer Daniels, please keep your voice down and address counsel respectfully. Daniels turned to the judge, his eyes narrowing. With all due respect, Your Honor, I know what suspicious behavior looks like. I've been doing this job for 15 years. The emphasis he placed on with all due respect made it clear he meant the opposite. Several people in the courtroom exchanged uncomfortable glances. Officer, Judge Wilson said calmly, your experience is not in question. Please simply answer the questions as asked. Chen continued. The defendant's hands were visible on the steering wheel in the video, correct? Yes, but... And he provided his license and registration when requested. Yes, Daniels admitted. So what specific behavior justified the search before establishing probable cause? Daniels' patience snapped. Look, these drug dealers know all the tricks. They act all innocent, but I've seen it all before. This neighborhood, that time of night, we all know what's going on. Judge Wilson tapped his gavel once. Officer Daniels, stick to the facts of this case. Daniels turned to the judge, his face flushed with anger. The facts? The facts are that criminals get away with everything these days because judges like you are too soft on crime. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The prosecutor stood up, alarmed. Your Honor, may we have a brief recess? But Daniels wasn't finished. I'm out there risking my life every day while you sit up there in your fancy robe making decisions that put officers in danger. Judge Wilson's expression remained calm, though his eyes hardened. Officer Daniels, you are close to being held in contempt. I suggest you control yourself. Daniels laughed bitterly. Contempt. That's rich coming from someone who got their position through a quota system rather than merit. The courtroom fell completely silent. The prosecutor's mouth hung open in shock. Sarah Chen stared in disbelief. Even the defendant looked stunned by the officer's outburst. Judge Wilson sat perfectly still for a moment, his face betraying no emotion. 20 years on the bench had taught him to control his reactions, especially in moments like this. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. Bailiff, please escort the jury out. Everyone else will remain seated. As the jury filed out, looking confused and concerned, Daniels stood defiantly at the witness stand, arms crossed over his chest. He seemed to think he had won some kind of victory. Once the jury was gone, Judge Wilson removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. He looked directly at Officer Daniels, who for the first time began to sense that he might have miscalculated badly. Officer Daniels, Judge Wilson began, his voice steady, you have just disrupted my courtroom, shown disrespect to this court, and made statements that call into question your ability to testify objectively. He paused. Before I decide how to proceed, is there anything you would like to say for yourself? Daniels' confidence visibly faltered as he realized the seriousness of his situation. The entire courtroom waited, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Daniels stood frozen at the witness stand. The confidence that had fueled his outburst was quickly evaporating under Judge Wilson's steady gaze. The courtroom remained completely silent, every person present holding their breath. Daniels began, then stopped. He glanced around the courtroom, perhaps looking for support, but found none. Even his partner, Officer Reynolds, was staring at the floor, visibly uncomfortable. I was just stating my opinion, Your Honor. Judge Wilson's expression didn't change. Your opinion about my qualifications and how I obtained my position on this bench is not relevant to these proceedings, Officer Daniels. Nor is it appropriate for you to express such opinions in my courtroom while testifying under oath. Daniels shifted his weight from one foot to the other. For the first time, he looked uncertain. I apologize if I overstepped, Your Honor. If, Judge Wilson repeated quietly. The prosecutor, District Attorney James Martinez, stood up. Your Honor, on behalf of the District Attorney's office, I want to express our profound apology for Officer Daniels' behavior. His comments do not reflect the views of our office or the police department. Judge Wilson nodded at Martinez but kept his focus on Daniels. Officer Daniels, I am calling a 1-hour recess. When we reconvene, I will decide how to proceed. Bailiff, please escort Officer Daniels to the conference room down the hall. He is not to leave the building or communicate with anyone except his union representative if he wishes to call one. As the bailiff approached, Daniels seemed to realize the seriousness of his situation. His face paled. Your Honor, I didn't mean. That will be all for now, officer, Judge Wilson interrupted firmly. We will discuss this when court reconvenes. As Daniels was led away, Judge Wilson stood up. Court is in recess for 1 hour. He tapped his gavel once and left the bench, walking with measured steps to his chambers. Once inside with the door closed, Marcus finally allowed himself to react. He let out a long breath and sank into his chair, loosening his robe around his neck. In 20 years as a judge, he had faced disrespect before, but rarely so blatant and never so personal. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he called. Tanya entered, concern written across her face. "Judge Wilson, are you all right?" Marcus gave her a small smile. "I'm fine, Tanya. Just thinking about what to do next." The chief judge called. He'd heard about what happened and wants to speak with you. Marcus nodded. "Tell him I'll call him back in 10 minutes. And could you please bring me Officer Daniels' complete personnel file? I want to see those complaints we mentioned this morning." "Right away, Your Honor." When Tanya left, Marcus stood and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse square. Below, people went about their day, unaware of the drama unfolding above them. He thought about his father again, about all the indignities he had suffered with quiet dignity. He thought about his own path, college on scholarship, law school while working nights, years as a public defender before being appointed to the bench. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Tanya returned with a thick file. "Officer Daniels' record, Your Honor," and I took the liberty of printing out the courthouse security camera footage from the hallway before court. It shows Officer Daniels making those comments I overheard. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That was good thinking, Tanya. Thank you." After she left, Marcus opened the file and began to read. The picture that emerged was troubling. 4 excessive force complaints in the past 2 years, all involving minority suspects. Several reprimands for insubordination. Notes from a superior officer recommending additional training on community relations. None of the complaints had resulted in serious disciplinary action. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed the chief judge's number. "Richard? Yes, it's Marcus. We have a situation here that needs careful handling." For the next 30 minutes, Marcus spoke with the chief judge, then the police chief, and finally the district attorney. By the time the hour was nearly up, he had made his decision. As he put his robe back on and prepared to return to the courtroom, Marcus knew that what he was about to do would likely make headlines. But more importantly, it would send a message that was long overdue. 3 days after the shocking courtroom incident, Officer Scott Daniels sat in the empty classroom at the police academy, staring at the blank notepad in front of him. He was early for his first mandatory bias training session, one of Judge Wilson's requirements. His mind kept replaying the moment Judge Wilson had delivered his ruling. The memory made his stomach twist with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and something new to him, shame. The door opened, and a woman in her mid-40s entered. She wore slacks and a blazer, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. "Officer Daniels? I'm Dr. Renee Taylor. I'll be facilitating your training sessions." Daniels nodded stiffly, but didn't speak. Dr. Taylor sat down across from him. "I understand you're here as part of Judge Wilson's ruling. How are you feeling about that?" "How do you think I'm feeling?" Daniels snapped. "My career is hanging by a thread because I spoke my mind." Dr. Taylor didn't react to his tone. "Let's start by reviewing what happened in your own words." Daniels recounted the courtroom incident, his version painting himself as the victim of an overly sensitive judge. When he finished, Dr. Taylor remained silent for a moment. "Officer Daniels, do you know Judge Wilson's background?" she finally asked. "What does that matter?" "Humor me," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Daniels shrugged. "Some fancy law school, I guess. Connections in the right places." Dr. Taylor opened a folder. Judge Marcus Wilson grew up in Oakland. His father was a janitor at the courthouse where he now presides. His mother worked 2 jobs as a nurse's aide. He attended public schools and earned a full scholarship to UC Berkeley. He worked nights to pay for living expenses. After graduating top of his class from law school, he spent 10 years as a public defender before being appointed to the bench. He was later elected to the position with 68% of the vote. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He didn't have connections," Dr. Taylor continued. "He didn't have family money. What he had was intelligence, work ethic, and determination." For the first time, doubt flickered across Daniels' face. "How do you know all this?" "Because I did my research," Dr. Taylor replied. "Just like you should have before making assumptions about a person's qualifications based on their race." The words hit Daniels like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Wilson was meeting with Captain Rivera of the Oakland Police Department's Community Relations Division. They sat in a small community center in the heart of the neighborhood where Daniels patrolled. The first group of residents will arrive in about 20 minutes, Judge Wilson, Captain Rivera said. Are you sure you want to do this? No one would blame you if you left this entirely to the department. Marcus shook his head. This isn't just about Officer Daniels. It's about healing a relationship between the police and this community. The door opened, and a young officer poked her head in. Sir, Officer Daniels' partner, Mike Reynolds, is here. He's asking to speak with Judge Wilson. Marcus and Captain Rivera exchanged surprised glances. Send him in, Marcus said. Officer Reynolds entered, his cap in his hands. Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor. I know I wasn't summoned to be here today. What can I do for you, Officer Reynolds? Reynolds hesitated. I want to apologize for not speaking up when Scott, Officer Daniels, made those comments in the hallway that day, and I want to volunteer to join the community service project, not because I'm ordered to, but because I think it's important. Marcus studied the young officer carefully. Why now, Officer Reynolds? Because your ruling showed me that real leadership isn't about protecting your own at all costs. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Reynolds swallowed. And because my silence that day made me part of the problem. Marcus nodded slowly. Then I think we have a place for you in this project. As the community members began arriving for the meeting, Marcus thought about how a single incident was creating ripples that might lead to real change. Officer Daniels' disrespect had been shocking, but perhaps what would shock everyone even more would be the healing and growth that could come from it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing deep-seated attitudes never was, but for the first time, Marcus felt hopeful that something good could come from that terrible day in his courtroom. 2 weeks after the courthouse incident, the story had spread throughout Oakland and beyond. What began as a shocking confrontation in Judge Wilson's courtroom had transformed into something unexpected, a catalyst for change. The Oakland Tribune ran a front-page article titled "Judge's Unusual Ruling Sparks Conversation About Justice." The story detailed how Judge Wilson had chosen rehabilitation over punishment, requiring Officer Daniels to complete bias training and community service rather than ending his career. Online comments sections and social media buzzed with debate, many praising the judge's wisdom while others questioned if the punishment was severe enough. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Marcus sat in his office reviewing case files when Tanya knocked on his door. Judge Wilson, there's a reporter from Channel 8 News in the lobby. She's requesting an interview about the Daniels case. Marcus shook his head. Please tell her what I've told all the others. I don't comment on specific cases or rulings. Tanya nodded. Also, the police chief called. He says 3 more officers have voluntarily signed up for the bias training program. This news made Marcus pause. 3 more? That's unexpected. And apparently Officer Reynolds is behind it. He's been talking to his fellow officers about his experience with the community service project. For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt a genuine smile spread across his face. Sometimes change came from the most unexpected places. Across town, Officer Daniels was finishing his 4th community service shift at the East Oakland Youth Development Center. Today, he was helping a group of teenagers plant a vegetable garden in what had once been an empty lot behind the center. Officer D, check this out, called Jamal, a 15-year-old who had been wary of Daniels when he first arrived. Jamal held up a fat earthworm wiggling between his fingers. Good find, Daniels replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. Worms mean the soil is healthy. You know about gardening? Jamal asked, surprise evident in his voice. My grandma had a big garden when I was a kid, Daniels said. I used to help her every summer. As they worked side by side, Daniels found himself sharing stories about his grandmother's garden, while Jamal talked about his dream of becoming a botanist someday. For a brief moment, Daniels forgot he was here as punishment. For the first time in years, he was connecting with someone from this neighborhood as a person, not as a suspect or a problem. Later that afternoon, Ms. Jackson, the center's director, approached Daniels as he was getting ready to leave. Officer Daniels, I want to thank you for your work today. The kids really enjoyed having you here. Daniels nodded awkwardly. They're good kids. Yes, they are, she agreed. You know, when Judge Wilson first called me about having you do your community service here, I was skeptical. We've had difficult experiences with police in the past. Daniels looked down, uncomfortable. I understand why. But I've noticed something interesting these past few weeks, Ms. Jackson continued. Some of our teenagers who would normally avoid police officers at all costs are actually talking to you. That's no small thing. Before Daniels could respond, the center's door opened and a tall, familiar figure walked in. Judge Wilson had arrived for the community meeting he'd been hosting weekly as part of his own commitment to the neighborhood. Daniels froze, unsure what to do. This was the first time he'd seen the judge since that day in court. Judge Wilson spotted Daniels and walked over, his expression unreadable. "Officer Daniels, I understand you've been doing good work here." "Just fulfilling the requirements, Your Honor," Daniels said stiffly. Judge Wilson studied him for a moment. "Ms. Jackson tells me you've been going beyond the required hours." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't told anyone at the precinct that he'd been coming in on his days off. The garden project needed extra hands. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then Judge Wilson did something unexpected. He extended his hand. "Progress isn't about perfection, Officer Daniels. It's about moving in the right direction." After a brief hesitation, Daniels shook the judge's hand. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Too much had been said for that, but it was something equally powerful, acknowledgement of the possibility of change. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in Judge Wilson's courtroom. The morning dawned clear and bright as Officer Scott Daniels parked his patrol car outside the courthouse. He sat for a moment, staring at the imposing building, his stomach tight with nervousness. Today was the day he would return to Judge Wilson's courtroom, not as a disgraced officer completing court-ordered training, but as a witness in a new case. He checked his uniform in the rearview mirror, making sure everything was perfect. The last 6 months had changed him in ways he never expected when Judge Wilson had handed down his ruling. "You ready for this?" asked Officer Reynolds from the passenger seat. Daniels took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked into the courthouse together. Several officers nodded to Daniels as he passed, some with respect, others still with lingering suspicion. His journey had not been an easy one. The biased training that had initially felt like punishment had opened his eyes to patterns in his thinking he'd never acknowledged. The community service hours had turned into genuine relationships with people in the neighborhood he'd once viewed only through the lens of potential criminality. And the most surprising change of all, he'd requested to become a training officer, sharing what he'd learned with new recruits. Outside courtroom 3B, Daniels paused. "I'm going to use the restroom before we go in. Save me a seat." Reynolds nodded, and Daniels walked down the hallway. But instead of turning toward the restrooms, he headed for Judge Wilson's chambers. He'd arranged this private meeting days ago, knowing he needed to say something before facing the judge in court again. Tanya looked up when he approached her desk. Her expression was guarded, but not hostile. "He's expecting you, Officer Daniels. You can go in." Judge Wilson was at his desk, reviewing documents when Daniels entered. He looked up and gestured to the chair across from him. "Officer Daniels, please have a seat." Daniels sat down, removing his cap and placing it on his knee. For a moment, neither man spoke. "I appreciate you agreeing to see me before court, Your Honor," Daniels finally said. "What I have to say shouldn't be said in a courtroom full of people." Judge Wilson leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "I'm listening." Daniels had rehearsed this speech countless times, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself struggling for words. 6 months ago, I stood in your courtroom and disrespected you. Disrespected your position, your authority, and your humanity. He swallowed hard. There's no excuse for what I said or did that day. No, there isn't, Judge Wilson agreed quietly. I'd spent these months thinking about why I acted that way. The bias training helped me see things I didn't want to see about myself, about assumptions I made based on. Daniels hesitated. Based on race. It was still difficult for him to say it outright. Judge Wilson remained silent, allowing Daniels to continue. I'm not here asking for forgiveness, Your Honor. What I did was unforgivable. I'm here because I want you to know that your ruling changed my life. You could have ended my career that day, and no one would have blamed you. Instead, you gave me a chance to learn and change. Daniels reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. This is a letter I've written to every officer in the precinct. It details what I learned and how I'm committing to change. The chief approved its distribution yesterday. He placed it on the desk. I wanted you to be the first to read it." Judge Wilson picked up the letter and read it carefully. When he finished, he looked at Daniels with new eyes. "This is significant, Officer Daniels." "It's just a start," Daniels replied. "I can't undo what I said that day, but I can make sure my actions from now on reflect who I want to be, not who I was." Judge Wilson stood and extended his hand. "The measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, Officer Daniels. It's in how they respond when confronted with those mistakes." As they shook hands, both men understood something profound had occurred. The story that had begun with disrespect and prejudice had transformed into something neither could have predicted: an opportunity for growth, accountability, and genuine change. Later, as Judge Wilson called his courtroom to order and saw Officer Daniels take the stand, he reflected on how sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways. The headlines had called his ruling shocking, but perhaps the most shocking outcome was how one moment of confronting bias had rippled outward, touching not just one officer, but an entire community. The hour passed slowly for everyone involved in the case. In the conference room, Officer Daniels sat alone, his initial defiance giving way to growing worry. His phone had been confiscated by the bailiff, leaving him with nothing to do but think about what had just happened. For the first time, he considered the possibility that his career might be in serious jeopardy. In the courtroom, spectators whispered among themselves. A few reporters who had been covering routine cases scribbled notes furiously, recognizing that they had just witnessed something that would make headlines. The defendant in the drug case sat quietly beside his attorney, looking confused by the sudden turn of events that had nothing to do with him. District Attorney Martinez shook his head. "I don't know, but Officer Daniels just compromised our entire case with his behavior." At exactly 1 hour after the recess began, the bailiff called the court to order. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Wilson." Judge Wilson entered the courtroom, his face composed and dignified. He took his seat at the bench and surveyed the packed room before speaking. "Before we continue with the Barnes case, we need to address the behavior of Officer Scott Daniels." He nodded to the bailiff. "Please bring Officer Daniels back to the courtroom." Daniels entered a moment later, escorted by the bailiff. His face was pale, but his jaw was set stubbornly. He stood before the bench, hands clasped behind his back. "Officer Daniels," Judge Wilson began, his voice clear and measured, "you have displayed contempt for this court through your words and actions today. You have made statements that question my qualifications and suggested that my appointment to this bench was based on race rather than merit." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the usual shuffling and coughing had stopped as everyone focused on the drama unfolding. "I have several options available to me," Judge Wilson continued. "I could hold you in contempt and have you jailed. I could refer this matter to the police commissioner with a recommendation for your termination. I could also simply remove you from this case, which would likely result in the charges against Mr. Barnes being dismissed due to lack of evidence." Daniels swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. However, Judge Wilson said, leaning forward slightly, "I believe that justice is not merely about punishment. It's about rehabilitation and growth." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. "Officer Daniels, I have reviewed your record. You have 15 years of service, with commendations for bravery. You also have 4 complaints of excessive force against minority suspects in the past 2 years, and several notes about insubordination." Daniels looked shocked that the judge had accessed his personnel files so quickly. "Here is my ruling," Judge Wilson said. "You will complete a comprehensive bias training program, 40 hours over the next 2 months. You will perform 100 hours of community service in the same neighborhood where you patrol, working directly with the community members you serve. You will be assigned a senior officer as a mentor for the next 6 months, who will report on your progress." The judge paused, looking directly at Daniels. "If you complete these requirements satisfactorily, this incident will not end your career. If you fail to do so, I will personally recommend your termination to the police commissioner." The courtroom erupted in whispers. No one had expected this outcome. Additionally, Judge Wilson continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the murmurs. "I am removing you as a witness in the Barnes case, and due to lack of evidence, the charges against Mr. Barnes are dismissed." He turned to the defendant. "Mr. Barnes, You are free to go. However, I strongly suggest you consider this a wake-up call and make better choices in the future. Finally, Judge Wilson addressed Daniels again. Officer, do you understand my ruling? Daniels stood frozen for a moment, clearly stunned by the unexpected outcome. Yes, Your Honor, he finally managed to say. Do you accept these conditions, or would you prefer I pursue contempt charges? Daniels straightened his shoulders. I accept the conditions, Your Honor. Judge Wilson nodded. Very well, you are dismissed. Report to Captain Rivera tomorrow morning to begin your training program. As Daniels turned to leave, Judge Wilson added one more thing. Officer Daniels, remember this. True justice isn't about revenge. It's about creating the opportunity for change. Whether you use that opportunity is entirely up to you. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Daniels walked out. No one had expected such a measured and thoughtful response to such a blatant display of disrespect. But then again, no one knew Judge Marcus Wilson quite as well as they thought they did.